You can see the entire documentary and part 1, again, at our website. We have all sorts of programs. Now, this video obviously was produced prior to the election. In fact, it was produced last fall. And we drew upon scholars and politicians, experts from both the mainland and from Taiwan and the United States, trying to get many different perspectives on these issues. That's, of course, one of the things that you're trying to do as part of the Straight Talk Forum. It's really an impressive effort that you have underway. Now, what I'm going to talk about now is the election itself and some of the implications of the result of that election. Now, for those who primarily live in the United States and have been following, for example, the Republican presidential debates, and we're pretty much done with those debates, but altogether there were about 20 of them. Do you know how often Taiwan came up in those debates? In the 20 hours, the most successful program for cable television last summer and last fall, how many times did the subject of the relationship between the United States and Taiwan, or the relationship between Taiwan and China, come up? No. Came up once. It wasn't completely forgotten. And the person who brought it up, though, has been forgotten. That's Rick Perry, the governor of Texas. And he brought it up. Who can tell me? Who can tell me why the governor of Texas brought it up? That might be part of the inspiration, but the main thing is that Governor Perry is concerned with what? With jobs in Texas. And if the United States would have agreed to sell more advanced fighter planes to Taiwan, they would have been manufactured in Texas. So he was particularly attuned to this. Now, this wasn't always the case. If you go back to the 1950s, American politicians talked about Taiwan a lot. And so, for example, in 1955, 1958, the Eisenhower administration talked a lot about what they called Quemoy, Jinmen, the island just off the China coast. It was the subject of considerable discussion. And in fact, you have propaganda from both sides. On the left, we've got a piece of mainland propaganda about the need, we must liberate Taiwan. And then on the right, we have, of course, the notion about opposing Chairman Mao. But it came up in American politics, especially in the 1960 debates between Republican candidate Richard Nixon, who was the sitting vice president, and Senator John Kennedy, the Democratic nominee. It came up, there were 4 debates, and it was the dominant subject in 3 of those debates. What should the United States do if China were to act? And again, the focus was not so much on the big island of Taiwan, but on the subsidiary islands just off the China coast. And if you wanted to, you can see this discussion. You have to first, of course, remember that when they're talking about Taiwan, they use the term Formosa, right? So it was a big subject. Now, you folks all know this stuff. You know that China and Taiwan have a very close economic relationship, that China has been Taiwan's top trading partner for a long time, replacing Japan, replacing the United States in that position. And that only continues to grow. And you can see, the proportions here. And in last year, the first 10 months, how much trade, two-way trade, existed between China and Taiwan. And you may know that in terms of the balance of payments, it's very much in Taiwan's favor. And you may, there we are. You can see that in terms of the share of Taiwan's trade, China occupies the largest chunk of it, Japan number 2, and just behind that, the United States. And then you can see the destination for Taiwanese exports. So the impact of growing economic ties is very clear. But it's not just about goods. It's not just about computer chips and cell phones and all sorts of other things. It's also about direct contact. Now, when Kennedy and Nixon debated in 1960, there wasn't this kind of human contact. In fact, in 1958, Chairman Mao cast a ballot in the American congressional elections that November. You may not have known that. He ordered a heavier bombardment of Jinmen just ahead of the election. He was determined in that instance to drive Republicans from power. Okay? And he explicitly said he wanted to affect the relationship. And so in those days, there were bombs and there were propaganda balloons. But now what have we got? Tourists. Millions of tourists. And now individual tourists. Taiwan has announced that it will admit 1,000 individual tourists every day. Every day. So it's a huge direct exchange, something that never existed. It's a remarkable thing. Now, where do people in the United States stand? If we take a look at a poll that's now, unfortunately, a couple years old, but this is the most recent major poll on this subject. What's most important? Should the United States make it clear, stand firm and say, we will stand with Taiwan if it comes under attack? Or is it more important to maintain good relations? You can see that a majority of Americans responding to this poll said, take a strong stand. Well, of course, that's what many people in China and in Taiwan want. They want clarity. But what's the official American position? What's the opposite of clarity? Right? Ambiguity, strategic ambiguity. The U.S. position is we don't want to offer either side assurances because we're afraid what the other side might do, or we're afraid that the side that we support would be emboldened and would upset the peaceful status quo. Now, of course, what this poll doesn't show is the percentage of Americans who asked about this didn't know what Taiwan was. Okay. And they were curious about a place called Thailand, or maybe they weren't very clear on Taiwan's status. Many Americans assume that since Taiwan has a military, has a president, people have passports, it must be an independent country. Because, of course, in almost every respect, it gets treated that way. A little bit later in 2010, another poll, another set of discussions. And you can see most Americans don't think that a confrontation between the mainland and China would produce a big issue for the United States. Only a fifth answered. But 60% almost said it's important but not critical, and said we should sell weapons no matter what the Chinese government says. Should we send troops, though? No. No. Well, what actually happened on January 14th? You folks know these results probably very well, but let's just compare the results from 2008 to 2012. And you can see it's mostly blue, the Kuomintang success. These are the presidential results. But you can see a narrowing in terms of the votes that Ma Ying-jeou got in 2008 with how many he got in 2012. Tsai Ing-wen increased the Democratic Progressive Party's vote total and narrowed the gap. And you can see the emergence of some green up in northern Taiwan. here are the results of the legislative election. Most Americans and most people in general focused on the presidential election. But for the first time, the presidential election and the legislative election were held at the same time. And you can see that the Kuomintang continues to dominate the legislature, but that its proportion has shrunk considerably. And you can see the rise of these smaller parties, the Taiwan Solidarity Union. You also have the People First Party now having some votes. Well, let's look very quickly at some of the advertising. So here we have an ad, part of a campaign book, actually, for Ma Ying-jeou, arguing how upright he is. And here we have a testimonial from a friend that, yeah, Ma Ying-jeou's a great guy, but I don't get any benefit from it. I don't profit from my friendship, okay? And this is, of course, in direct opposition to what the Democratic Progressive Party was putting forward. And so, sorry, this jumps a little bit. Tsai Ing-wen, the Democratic Progressive Party campaign, among its themes, of course, is you need what? You need peace, you need stability, you need warmth, this softer image. We need to be concerned with the well-being of the people. Sorry. Let's take a look at the candidates in just, let's take a look at the candidates, then we'll look at a couple of commercials. So here's one candidate. This is the fellow with the most experience on the political scene, longtime Kuomintang official, former head of the Government Information Office, and somebody who finished second in 2000 when running for the presidency. And so James Song leading the People First Party, the orange color. A lot of their supporters looked like Caltrans workers, wearing their vests and that sort of thing. Okay, so we have our candidates. Let me take a look at some of the campaign commercials. One of the themes for the Democratic Progressive Party was that things had become tougher, things had become harder, and that you needed somebody who would stand up for the little guy. So we're going to look at a Democratic Progressive Party ad that opens not with something out of Taiwanese tradition, not with something out of Chinese tradition, but with Robin Hood.
I've never been good at
罗宾汉能打倒迂腐的强权，不只是因为他武艺高强，而是他有人民支持，那是最可贵、最强大的力量。就像小
All
猪，
of us need to
不
help
只是小
others.
猪，
We need to be
而是千千
concerned.
万万个你
And now there's
汇聚在一起
discussion，about
呼唤公平正义
the
的
role
力
of
量。
these little pigs.
无论你有没有小猪，每个人
We
都
can
是
all
罗宾
join
汉。
together, and together
12
we
月
can
10
make
号
things
一起
happen.
站出来，到凯道汇聚这股正义的力量。
So that's the slogan for the DPP, Taiwan Next, the next step. Now, one of the interesting things is how the parties latch on to English terms, Taiwan Next. And you'll see, for example, for the Kuomintang, they use Taiwan Bravo. Neither really are quite fluent English, and they don't really resonate out of the Chinese. But we'll take a look. Now, Ma Ying-jeou, the Kuomintang ad.
我希望下一代还可以看到他们的希望。
让爱你子子孙孙未来的希望。
The election on January 14th. We need to stand up. We need to come out. We need to turn out.
如果你相信这是一种价值，
相信一种人民该尽所有努力，
用尽全部的力
For
量，
those who don't read the Chinese, it's listing their ages.
我们一起走过世界的动荡，我们也即将面对多变的未来。
我们必须
去投出你的希望，捍卫你心中的价值，信心的支票。
元月14日，2月14号，我们必须站出来，
投下你最珍贵的一票。
Feel you need to go and rally, go and vote, do something? We'll look at maybe, if we have some time, look at some of the other campaign ads. Some of them are quite humorous, and not all of them are created by the campaigns themselves. Because of the new media age, you have individuals creating their own advertising. They're joining these campaigns. And one of the striking things is that all of these campaigns, they had iPhone applications, they had Facebook pages, and they tuned in to people. And people would upload their own pictures, they would upload their own videos. Let's take a look at some of the issues here. First of all, who gets to decide what the issues will be in a presidential campaign? We in the United States are in the midst of a campaign. Who decides what the issues are? The media? I'm sorry? People, how? I mean, clearly the candidates, they come out and they're responding to something. So they may be responding to polls, they may be responding to focus groups. They have a sense of what people are talking about, and they're concerned about that. Now, they want to talk about those issues in a particular way, because their aim, of course, is to mobilize supporters. And so economic performance was a huge issue. And so you had the Kuomintang, the party in power, talking about success. Look how much trade is expanding. At the same time, they wanted to emphasize that although trade with China had gone up, they wanted to emphasize that trade with everybody else had gone up even faster. Why would they emphasize that? They were concerned that the Democratic Progressive Party's criticism of this China-centric economic development would place Taiwan at risk. So they wanted to say, no, we're diversifying. We're not putting all of our eggs in the mainland basket. Economic performance was one of the issues. Social equality and justice. This is the slogan for the Democratic Progressive Party, that things have become increasingly unequal, that not everybody has access to the opportunities that are developing. And the People First Party, their argument was, yes, Ma is okay, but he's not effective. The Kuomintang government is neither responsive nor is it responsible. It denies that it should be held accountable for performance. Another giant issue that can't be separated from economics is the cross-strait relationship. And one of the central issues was, is there a consensus within Taiwan on how to work with or against or separately from the mainland? Is there a consensus within Taiwan? And is there a consensus across the strait? This was a huge issue. The assumption on the part of many was, no, there is no consensus. Can one be found? How could one be developed? Is Taiwan becoming too dependent? And then another issue had to do, again, with integrity and fairness. The DPP complained bitterly that because the Kuomintang controlled the government, it was able to use all sorts of government resources to advance its campaign. And you might see some examples of that in the slides that follow. So, for example, the Kuomintang-dominated government could have ads in every newspaper saying, "Isn't it neat that now you have a passport that allows you to go visa-free to more than 100 countries?" They used government resources for those advertisements. The DPP complained about that. There's also complaints about corruption and about use of the judicial system to punish political opponents. Many different complaints. Now, the last one is something that we'll talk about at the end, the question of outside influences. And the two big outside influences that were discussed were the role played by China in the decision by people in Taiwan over who would govern them. What was the role China was playing? And what role, if any, was the United States playing? This was a subject hotly debated in the last days of the campaign. Can anyone read this? This is an eye test. Yeah, neither can I. So let's look at a simplified. This thing has a mind of its own, I'm afraid. Here is the most recent survey. The Mainland Affairs Council conducts surveys, and it brings together surveys conducted by others. This particular survey was conducted by one of Taiwan's most prestigious university, Zhengzhou University, and here we get a sense of where the people in Taiwan stand on the relationship with the mainland. And overwhelmingly, they say keep things as they are. Maintain the status quo indefinitely. You can see 1 out of 4 says that. 1 out of 3 says, yeah, let's keep the status quo and make some decision at some point that we're not going to name. Fewer than 1/5 of the adults in Taiwan call for independence at some later date. And only about 1 in 10 say, at some point, okay, we can unify with the mainland. And only a tiny handful of people call for independence now or unification now. Well, the people who pay the most attention to this, of course, are the politicians. They can read this. They understand that talking about independence, talking about unification, appeals to what? A losing total of votes. You've got to appeal to that large majority that may not like the way things are, but they understand how they are, and they fear change. So here are some of the ads. Now, this is a government ad providing you with a phone number, providing you with a website, and saying what? Let's not sell votes, buy votes. All right? None of that. Here is that passport advertisement. Now, this one, of course, favors the people who helped to make this possible. The expansion of the number of places that people from Taiwan can travel with a Taiwan passport. Now, the campaign in Taiwan, a lot of politics is retail. People go out. They spend a lot of time. Taiwan's a relatively small place. It's got 23 million people, so it's about 2/3 the size of California. But mostly the campaign is an air war, fought out on television, on radio, in the press, with advertisements. Party organization matters, and it's probably going to matter even more in the future.